Good afternoon, everybody. I want to walk you through a couple ideas to think about as context for understanding Margaret Atwood's A Handmaid's Tale. I hope you've enjoyed reading this novel, and with that in mind, it's worth paying attention to some of the ideas encoded in her pretty interesting story. So let's just start with some context for reading and understanding her novel a bit more. One thing that we should look at first is her use of postmodernism. This is a story that throws us right into the middle of an unnamed narrator. And we don't know exactly what information we can trust. We don't know what is told to be reliable. And we also have to kind of question how even the guilt of this narrator might affect what she has to say about herself and how honest she can be, for example, about her new feelings for Nick. There's a lot of other scenes in here too that are filled in through gaps. The story of Maura's escape is told is a third hand kind of encounter, and it's passed along through the network of handmaids. So there's this kind of question of gaps in the story, what's been blown up, hyperbolized, what's been minimized. And we also see the narrator kind of shifting through layers of time, which is very similar to the way that our minds actually work. As Virginia Woolf once said, life is not a series of gig lamps symmetrically arranged. And so, just as history itself is filled with inconsistencies, gaps, paradoxes, multiple truths, we can say that postmodernism gives us this way of looking at truth more fully. So, it tries to tell truths rather than giving us a single vision of that. One example of this, how this plays out in the novel, for me, is when we think about the narrator's reflection on what happened to her husband, Luke. And she says on page 104 that, I believe Luke is lying face down in a thicket, a tangle of brackets, the brown fronds from last year under the green ones just unrolled. His face is beginning to fade. And so maybe he's been killed. She said, I also believe Luke is sitting up in a rectangle somewhere, gray cement, on a ledge or the edge of something, a bed or a chair. God knows what he's wearing. God knows what they put on him. God isn't the only one who knows, so maybe there could be some way of finding out. So she envisions him in the second version as somebody who's been captured, a POW. And then the third thought is that I also believe they didn't catch him or catch up with him, and that he's made it out of Gilead. So, like the narrator of the story, we are, as readers, left in doubt. There are multiple stories. And as the narrator reminds us throughout the novel, this is a reconstruction, or that is a reconstruction too. She draws attention constantly to the shifting nature of truth. Perhaps you've experienced what we might call historical revisioning within your own family. Try this sometime. Ask your siblings to recount a particular family member memory, something maybe your family did on vacation, and you'll notice that you'll get different versions. So this raises questions for us as readers, and one of them is, where else is she inconsistent, or where do we see the limitations in her storytelling? And by that nature of questioning the truth, what stories does she choose to tell us? After all, presumably she's telling this through a series of tapes. And what does she, choose to exclude? Just like somebody would in their memoir. Some other postmodern techniques is that in the story, the narrator is unnamed. I know in Hulu, her name is June, and we could surmise that maybe because of all the names passed about in the opening part, which takes place in a gym. No better place than to re-indoctrinate or educate people than a school system with its rules and its control factors. But in some ways, she is every woman. She is no woman in particular. She could be one of the countless people in history whose names and stories we don't particularly know. We'll get to maybe some of these other ideas of how we interpret history. But one thing that a postmodern novel like this does is collapse the idea of what is fiction and what is nonfiction. In other words, Atwood draws attention in this story to the idea that, history is also fiction in that it is inconsistent and it's filled with gaps and paradoxes. So another thing that you may have paid attention to is in chapter 24, there's this story that the narrator is reminded of. And she remembers watching this episode with her mother about the mistress of one of the architects of the Holocaust. And in this story, the woman is sort of an apologist for her, her lover, and says, "Oh, he wasn't evil." And Atwood remarks upon this through the narrator by saying, it's easy to invent a human history for someone. And so even the most terrible people can come up as, seeming human, seeming, understandable. And I think that's an interesting part of it, because here the commander, starts to feel like he wants somebody to sympathize with his point of view. He wants a return to the ordinary as much as anybody else seems to. And then, of course, what we have here is the indisputable fact that Atwood has put us in a dystopia. That is an imagined world that has grown out of what has happened in the present. So, for example, unlike a utopia where everything is wonderful, a dystopia is a plausible creation of a future in which everything that we have been doing wrong is magnified. So, for example, in a dystopia, people are typically controlled through fear, ignorance, propaganda, uncertainty, all of the things that work in this novel. Oh, it's important that nobody can trust anybody else in this story. We don't know if Nick is a good guy or if he's one of the eyes. You never know exactly who could betray you. And so this fear and ignorance keeps people, uncertain. It throws them off balance. It makes them afraid to resist, and it makes them afraid to act, even on a word, using a word like Mayday. So all of these kind of techniques are used in the story. In the Hulu version, as I'm sure some of you have seen, technology is even more expansive than it was when Atwood wrote this story. But the same kind of tactics that work in dystopic futures in the 80s is just magnified. So there's a lot of examples of dystopias. You probably are most familiar with George Orwell's 1984, where society is ruled by the dictates: war is peace, freedom is slavery, and ignorance is strength. And there's this saying in that novel that he who controls the past controls the present. And that's certainly true of when we think of big brothers. Perhaps Mao is the most likely person that Orwell had in mind. And Mao did his best to eradicate Chinese history and focus on his regime as the beginning of China's origins. So one of the things he did was ban what were called the olds. And this included, imperial texts, it included calligraphy, it included, reading things that might have shown a different model for how to behave. So in Orwell's world, of course, we've got telescreens to monitor. And you even control the way you think by controlling or reducing vocabulary. The proles, interestingly, seem to have some freedom. They might be a little bit like the econowives, but freedom is pretty limited here. And just as in a dystopia or in Mao's campaign for re-education of the liberals, you send them out to a countryside. In this particular novel, you take all the fertile women, you put them in a red center, and you use fear propaganda and reprogramming to change them into docile, tractable women who will then passively accept their roles. Other things you might be familiar with, Huxley's Brave New World, where basically you take test tube babies and you raise them for the state, and you put people in categories. So the alphas, as you may suspect, are the ones who are the intelligentsia. They have control over scientific methods, whereas the deltas and the epsilons, for example, are in the mines. They are the worker bees for the colonies. And women are taught to be sexual and sexual objects and to focus quite a bit on their appearance. The control of literacy is also a very important feature of both dystopias and tightly controlled dictatorships. In this particular story, Fahrenheit 451, the idea is that you control people by constantly bombarding them with television. And that's I think we're there right now. We constantly get news updates, flashes, and this keeps us from thinking. And then, of course, in the role of this particular novel, firefighters and firemen, there is a fireman who's the protagonist here. Their role is to actually destroy books. This is a sort of bonfire. But maybe you're wondering now, and it would be a fair question, well, where do dystopian ideas come from? What prompts a writer like Atwood to write these kinds of stories? And Atwood has written several science fiction novels, and a lot of them fit into the category of dystopia. Well, they begin with the idea that there is a threat, there's something real that happens. So in, for example, the 1980s, you may or may not know that the threat of nuclear winter was a real scare. There were several environmental disasters, Chernobyl being one of them. And so Atwood imagined, let's say in the 1980s, what if there were a series of environmental disasters, things that devastated economies, interrupted the food supply, and let's say that this was one factor in, letting somebody else get into control. So, people are, let's say, distracted by a desire to find food. Their immediacy of fight or flight is kind of engaged. So somebody comes in and promises food, promises to fix things, and stability is really attractive. So what Atwood says of her novel is certainly true, that everything that happens here, meaning in the story, has happened somewhere else. So she's really inviting us to look at our own past. She's asking us to look at how dictators get control of people. And if you look right now, there are, places in the globe, and I could point to several of them, where there is a sort of rise of more strong leader types, and a pushback against freedoms, and a pushback against human rights. So it's imagining that a single belief system gains force. So another kind of context for Atwood would be Romania in the 1980s. I have a close friend who has talked to me about the way that Romanian women in the 1980s were treated. They had to undergo monthly tests to see if they were pregnant. And if they were indeed pregnant, they had to bring that baby to term, because at the time, under the dictatorship, Romania wanted to increase the amount of children for the good of the state, for nation building. So controlling fertility is a way of not only just controlling women, but it is often tied to something that seems to maybe strengthen a city, strengthen a country. Well, and then of course we can't ignore the fact that Atwood quite deliberately picks Massachusetts, the home of the Puritans, their ideal city on the hill, in which they were going to create a place where they could be have freedom of worship. They could purify their religion and remove any kind of papist elements, any ceremonial elements. And what did they do? Well, they came to America, pushed out other people, persecuted them. You can look up historical notes on how the Puritans treated the Quakers, who are treated in this particular story, have a look on page 107, as state enemies. Now, just as they were by, well, they have been treated by lots of people in power as state enemies because of their pacifist ideas, because of their anti-slavery campaigns. But by the Puritans, they were whipped through 7 states, or 7 counties sometimes or other, and were persecuted. Anne Hutchinson, of course, is a woman exiled for daring to read scripture by herself and insisting on her right to have a direct relationship with God. The resettlement of the children of Ham is a very obscure reference, Most of us might have, no idea what this means. It refers to a very obscure passage in the Old Testament where Noah is drunk in his tent. And if you can imagine, I imagine like Will Ferrell in this, film. Will Ferrell has to be a lot younger, but imagine like Will Ferrell and his brother coming in and seeing their dad naked, drunk, and I mean, you do what probably most teenagers do, you laugh. And Noah just gets angry at Ham for laughing, and he says, well, okay, smart aleck, for laughing at me, I'm going to banish your children, your descendants, so I'll be hewers of water and drawers of wood. And this line is important, though, because it was used to justify slavery. It was used to justify by white plantation owners their right to have dominion over their darker subordinate slaves, because this was given as, biblical justification. There's a lot of other kinds of context for this novel, but I'm getting too far into the weeds here. So I will just say a couple other things, maybe more quickly. The story speaks to Margaret Atwood's journey to Afghanistan, and the costumes that she develops for the Handmaids are part of the reconstruction of her memory of wearing a burqa and how you can't see, and it cuts off your peripheral vision. And this becomes, the ultimate control, because you can even control women's gaze. But we also see, of course, a backlash against feminism, which was going on pretty strikingly in the 1980s. In the novel, the story is more about the fear of becoming an unwoman and not being, valued. But Atwood is really slippery here. She shows that, sometimes people can be allies for causes when they don't have things in common otherwise. So she points to a late 1970s and early 80s push against pornography, which was endorsed by both feminists and the Christian right. The 1980s saw, of course, the rise of Tammy Faye Baker, a televangelist, and Phyllis Schlafly, a woman who almost single-handedly is responsible for the defeat of the Equal Rights Amendment. This was a bill that had wide support. This was an amendment that should have been passed. And a couple states actually rescinded their vote for the Equal Rights Amendment. But like Serena Joy, Phyllis Schlafly gave speeches about the sanctity of the home without staying in her own home. Phyllis Schlafly, like Serena Joy, had a lot of money and a lot of influence and used her power to persuade people to, return to domestic ways and return to their God-ordained roles as women. And so for Phyllis Schlafly, the idea was, oh, women are protected by the way things are. They now have rights. And if they, were under the Equal Rights Amendment, Phyllis Schlafly said, oh, women will have to be drafted and they're going to lose their support. And she made up this whole fear campaign, but it was very persuasive, and she was in the right context because the 1980s saw the rise of televangelism. It saw the Republican Party unify with some coalitions and forces that it hadn't fully integrated into its grouping. So there's a lot of change in the 80s. There was a push more in the 1980s to eradicate some of the separation of church and state. I'm going to just kind of skip over this part, but the idea of being, let's say, faceless and nameless behind the burqa, which is true of women who were forced to wear these in Afghanistan. And I'll just say that was not part of Afghanistan culture. It was imposed upon women under the Taliban. So also when people say, well, that's their culture, Atwood is showing us how quickly people become used to something. And we see this with the narrator talking about her own body and what used to feel normal, and how, now seeing these Japanese tourists, walking around with bare legs seems like a source of shame. So we're reminded of how quickly our ideas about ourselves would be altered if we were pressured and pushed enough into this reindoctrination. All right, so we have totalitarian regimes. We have also, of course, the enforcement of everyone being in a certain role as opposed to an individual. And we have, this kind of a spying system that works out really well here. But there is some small modicum of hope that's been introduced into this novel, and that is the idea that there's a resistance, there's an underground, and we see a chink in the Gilead control over its citizens because there is resistance. And we do see, for example, Mora being a woman on the loose. And Mora is an interesting character to contrast to the unnamed narrator. She's feisty, she's a lesbian, she is not putting up with any bullshit, right? And we see her, resisting and refusing to be what the ants want her to be. But then there's a price that Mora is paying for, resisting. And the question might be for you as you continue reading the novel, what happens to Mora, and what are we as readers of this novel to make of what happens to a person over time, being pressured and pushed into certain choices? Do you give up? Do you keep resisting? But what Margaret Atwood says about, it's difficult for us to see this novel, particularly as Americans, because we don't really understand what it's like to risk our lives for freedom. So it may be tempting to see the people in the story as very cowardly. Why don't they just band together more? But she says that it's a lot harder because we've seen maybe these Hollywood films that make it look too easy for the good people to win. But in the stories and others, there's always an underground. Resistance is possible, and we've seen it during the darkest moments of human history. But we also see the price that people pay for fighting back and resisting. A lot of them end up, as they do in the story, on the wall. And of course, we have to look at the wall and the place, Massachusetts. The setting is Harvard. And Harvard represents, in the story, the transformation of what is the powerhouse, the stronghold of human history and knowledge, become transformed again back into a patriarchal bulwark, one that will uphold Gilead. But Atwood's sly here, and she makes some jokes about even the exclusionary nature of Harvard and the way Harvard treated women during the time that she was in college. So women were not allowed to enter its sacred halls in the 1950s. So just another way that we might see this novel is through the lens of America's slavery past. We see women in this underground trying to get to Canada, just as men and women who tried to escape from the South under the conditions of slavery were, on these kind of stages of the Underground Railroad. So we see, this way that this plays out in America's past and present. Slaves, of course, like women in the novel, were forbidden to read and forbidden to write because this would give you knowledge. As Frederick Douglass noted, and he was an escaped slave from the South, he went on to be an abolitionist and a very effective speaker. He recognized that the power of knowledge and the power to prove that a person of color had the same competency as a white person was a very, important form of resistance. So we can see in this novel that just controlling knowledge, controlling the interpretation of texts, such as the Bible, reminds us of who's in control. Just as, only men or privileged people used to learn Latin. So it's sort of like this encoded text that only a few people can read. If we look at today, though, and see the idea of surrogates, poor women across the globe have, again, conveniently filled an important need, commodity for wealthier women. So women in India, for example, are often surrogates for women in India or women in the West who cannot bear their own children. So in a sense, what Atwood might be saying is those of us who are in any kind of position of privilege might be benefiting off the backs of other people. So we see women's bodies, particularly in this novel, as being conscripted by the state, being repurposed, right? And the movement into women as fertility slaves puts them in a particular role and gives them both desirability. They're something to trade, something to be prized, but they are also not important entities in their own right. This is something you're going to have to decide yourself. Is this a feminist novel? Well, I think it's important that Atwood just shows us that, there's no one consistency of how the women in this novel behave. In some ways, the women in the commander's household all kind of operate against each other. Rita and Cora are not necessarily fans of the handmaiden or Serena Joy. At the same time, women are not necessarily powerless in this story. There's also a way that we can see subversive power operating. It's a limited power, but it's worth saying that the unnamed narrator can get information through her relationship with the commander. She's always looking for something to trade. She's looking for something she can barter with because she knows that this is one kind of power. And another is simply to look at how older women are positioned to be the guardians of women, the ones who indoctrinate them. And they uphold these kind of categories and try to give, the handmaids, some reason to feel good about themselves. They encourage them to say, feel sorry for the commander's wives. The commander's wives are really pretty awful to the handmaids. But we see women being put into purposeful roles and then women serving as gatekeepers to keep other women in line. So in other words, it gives women a sort of power, but it puts them in the role of gatekeepers. So I just want to end with maybe just a few remarks about the body, this idea that women are protected in Gilead. And I was reminded here of something that Margaret Atwood said about wearing the burqa. She said it was, it keeps us from seeing, but also from being seen. And she said she felt like she was turned into herself a sort of negative space, that she was somehow, in this strange world where she could incite interest by, wearing this cloak where everybody kind of wondered, what's under that cloak? And it was mysterious and forbidden, but it also, kept women very regulated and controlled. And so we do see this emphasis of freedom to versus freedom from, right? So there's this idea that, don't underrate that you're being free from men who might attack you in public spaces. But there's a lot of a lot of problems with giving up your freedom. I'd say most women would desire to go into the public space and take what risks they may. But in this world, of course, all these decisions are made by other people who presumably know more. All right, so I hope this insight has helped a little bit on understanding the story. And I'm going to stop share and let you continue reading the novel. So more to come next week. Have a good one.